Terrific. I think we might get rolling here, and a few more people can join the Zoom room. So welcome everyone. Are we still there? Okay, good. Our slides went away. Welcome everyone. Thank you for taking some time this evening to join us on this this webinar. It's very exciting to be able to discuss this ongoing, happening right now exhibit, the practice of democracy, View from Connecticut, at the Housatonic Museum now, and traveling to two other community colleges, and we'll say more about that soon. So let me just say that this event is really a collaboration of a number of different groups. It includes Public Humanities at Yale, the Democracy in America programming that we've been doing for a couple of years now in collaboration with the New Haven Free Public Library. And we are joined by Marion Huggins, who is the branch manager of the Mitchell Branch Library. New Haven Free Public Library is an amazing institution. Of course, the Ives main branch is gorgeous and very important, but we have all of these really stellar branch libraries across the city that are so much a part of our civic infrastructure, and we're so happy to work with them. And just to say before handing it to Marion that we're collaborating too with the Regional Plan Association that's been so important in developing this exhibit. Melissa is here from the RPA, and it's awesome that the Housatonic Museum is represented as well as one of our collaborators, and Jennifer is here from then, and everyone will get their introduction in just a moment. So let me just say thank you again for joining us, and turn it over to Marion Huggins of the New Haven Free Public Library. Thank you, Marion, please.
Good evening, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Rubin. And you did a great job of opening the program, but I'll introduce you a little bit more. Elihu Rubin is an associate professor of urbanism at the Yale School of Architecture, where he teaches architectural history, urban studies, and urban design. He directs the Yale Urban Media Project, a New Haven-based public scholarship initiative, and is director of advocacy and planning at the Yale Urban Design Workshop. Again, I welcome everybody on behalf of the New Haven Free Public Library. I'd also like to introduce Jennifer Reynolds-Kay, the director of the Housatonic Museum of Art at the Housatonic Community College in Bridgeport. With a collection of over 7,000 artworks, the HMA holds one of the largest art collections of any community college in the country. It's quite impressive. She received her PhD in art history from the University of Southern California and has worked previously at the Yale Center for British Art and the Yale University Art Gallery. Melissa Kaplan-Macey is the Regional Plan Association's Vice President of State Programs and the Connecticut Director. Melissa is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. She holds a master's degree in urban planning from New York University's Wagner School of Public Service and a bachelor's in urban studies from Brown University. Our normal facilitator is not with us tonight. He's Professor Matthew Jacobson, who is a Yale University Sterling Professor of American Studies and History. He's the co-director of the Yale Public Humanities Program. His latest book is Dancing Down the Barricades, Sammy Davis Jr. and the Long Civil Rights Era. And I know we all can't wait to read that. So again, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Marion, for getting us rolling here. And I think what we're going to do to start is to set the table a little bit with Melissa and Jennifer presenting material from the exhibit, so our audience can get to know a little bit more about it and what's going on at the museum itself, the exhibit, and how people are participating with the exhibit. So yeah. Let's see, are we ready to share the screen with that slide deck? Excellent.
Great, thanks. And Jake, I think we'll actually just go straight to slide 5, if that's okay. I had a little bit of an introduction to Regional Plan Association, which we can kind of get to in the Q&A if people want a little bit more context. I'll just say just very briefly that the Regional Plan Association is a tri-state regional research policy and advocacy organization, and that primarily our work in Connecticut focuses on housing affordability. And we've had very good fortune to be working with some really, really terrific partners. And this project is just one of many projects that we're working on to advance a conversation around housing affordability in Connecticut, and this in particular to really highlight the history of how we got here as a jumping off point and a conversation starter. And really this program tonight fits in so perfectly with that on how we got here and as a means to making change into the future. So just going to do a little context setting on the exhibit. I'll walk us through it a little bit for folks who haven't had a chance to come. You'll get a little bit of a flavor, but I encourage everyone to come see it while it's at Bridgeport at Housatonic, and we'll have other opportunities to see it in other places in Connecticut. We'll be then traveling to Gateway Community College in New Haven and then over to Norwalk Community College. So just a little bit of what is the practice of democracy and what is this exhibition. It really started, and I want to just give a little bit of a shout out and acknowledgement to our director for the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity and the Centers for Housing Opportunity across Connecticut, who really just saw related exhibition work by April D. Simone, who's the curator of the practice of democracy, and really just understood how important this type of exhibition was as a tool, as a learning tool, and how important it was to bring it to Connecticut. So working with Christy, we were able to connect with April D. Simone, and she has, like I said, done this work across the whole country with Undesign the Red Line. Some folks may have seen We Hold These Truths, which was on the High Line in Manhattan over the spring and into the summer. And we were really, really very fortunate to be able to bring the exhibition to Connecticut. And as I mentioned, it'll be traveling. We get to start in Bridgeport and we'll travel around the state throughout this winter and into the spring. Next slide, please. So the exhibition has 4 parts: defining democracy, experiencing democracy, visioning democracy, and practicing democracy. And I'll talk about all 4 of those. Really what one of the many really cool things about being in the space and seeing the exhibition is you really, as you walk around the room and you look at all these panels, it really does take you through a journey, and it really tells a story and provokes a lot of understanding on narrative and conversation and how we got to where we are, and then also as a jumping off point for where do we go from here. Next slide. So we start with defining democracy, and the exhibition really opens with the Declaration of Independence, and it poses the question to the visitor, what do I see? Where do I see life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in my day-to-day life, and who can access democracy? And so as we're all aware, at the time of the Declaration of Independence and it's being written, and this idea of democracy in America, millions of people are enslaved in America at that same time. Millions of indigenous people had been displaced and murdered. The stark reality was that these prized tenets of democracy existed, but not for everyone. And so the defining democracy section really introduces these ironies and injustices and really puts it out in front of us. And you can see, those different documents lined up kind of one next to the other. There's some imagery of people enslaved at the same time as you see the Declaration of Independence, and really, how those injustices appear in local governance. And that's really demonstrated throughout the exhibit. Next slide, please. So the next section is on experiencing democracy, and this section of the exhibit is Connecticut and very Bridgeport specific. So while a lot of the information and the collection of materials has come from other exhibitions and other work with the practice of democracy, this really is a zoom in on Bridgeport and on New Haven and Norwalk. So when the exhibition travels to those locations, these panels will be swapped out for local stories in those communities as it moves through the colleges. It really details a number of local stories and microhistories in Bridgeport of the resilience and success, as well as the displacement and community dissolution resulting from policy decisions. And much of it really focuses in on housing and community development. These examples include Little Liberia, indicated on the slide here, which was south of I-95 along Main Street in the South End. Little Liberia, as it was known in the early 1800s, was an autonomous seafaring community of free Black people and Native Americans. It was comprised of 36 homes built by and for its wealthy Black and Native community members. Only the Freeman houses survive today, which are historical landmarks. It was known for its affluence and prosperity, incredibly rare for Black and Indigenous communities during a time of slavery, discrimination, and racial violence. And this focus on housing and community development really grounds and makes very tangible the conversation of how spatial decisions that were made through democratic processes have disparately and negatively impacted people of color throughout our country's history. Next slide, please. In this slide, when we get to visioning democracy, we really brings us to a broader policy framework and infrastructure projects in Connecticut that you may be all very familiar with, redlining and highway construction and slum clearance and urban renewal. And you can really see those things in practice and in play here in the exhibit. You can see on this slide, the Oak Street connector in New Haven, which destroyed thriving immigrant communities under the name of slum clearance for a highway project that was never even completed in its intended form. You can also see the redlining map of Bridgeport. Through these policies, cities like Bridgeport, New Haven, and Norwalk became segregated, excluded, siloed, and prosperity really existed around them as disinvestment and lack of opportunity seeped in. And this extreme inequality in America's urban centers didn't happen by accident. That's really one of the central points of the exhibition. These policies happened legally by way of our democratic process. They were intentional, and it really calls us to question whose voices are heard in our democratic process. Next slide. And then the last set of slides takes us to practicing democracy. And so these problems were created through intention, and we know that they must be solved through intention, that change doesn't just magically happen. It'll take intention from communities, advocates, policymakers to correct mistakes of the past and create a more equitable community. This last section calls on all of us to think about how democracy is practiced in our daily lives, to take what we've learned by visiting the exhibit and become a doer of democracy. This can range from being sensitive and inclusive with our word choice in our daily lives to running for office, passing legislation. Each small action we take to reflect on systems of inequality helps us move the needle. Questions throughout the exhibit are posted. How can we reconnect disinvested neighborhoods to their city and ensure longtime residents benefit? How can infrastructure projects in your city foster healing, equity, and justice? It's really important that we experience this and we don't just sort of walk away and say, well, you know, that was some good information, but conversations like the one we're having tonight and ongoing is really the point of the exhibition, is to provoke thought and to provoke conversation and to really help us make the hard choices and practices moving forward to really correct and address the inequity that is really literally baked into our environment. So with that, I will turn it over to Jennifer, and she'll talk to us about the experience of having the exhibition on at HMA and what the engagement has been with the community in Bridgeport.
Great, thank you so much, Melissa. We can go to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So we're very lucky to be the first venue of this 3-part traveling exhibition. And I'll be sharing a little bit about related programming and engagement with the exhibition. So before I delve into that, I want to say a little bit about the Housatonic Museum of Art. As was mentioned in the introduction, we are proudly one of the largest art collections of any community college in the country. We were founded in the 1960s by Bert Chernow and have a strong collection that's displayed throughout the campus. So hallways, staff offices, shared academic spaces, original works of art everywhere. I'm 6 months into my position as the director and was lucky enough to inherit this exhibition. And I'll just mention on the left, you'll see a photo of 2 of our student docents who gave tours twice a week of the exhibition. And on the right, a lively scene from our opening on January 17th. Next slide, please. So it was also really important to me to make the most of our Bert Chernow galleries, which is our special exhibition space, and to sort of expand on these ideas and various dimensions of democracy. So to accomplish both of these goals, I invited the Bridgeport Portrait Project to create a complementary exhibition to the practice of democracy. In this project, Jay Misenchik and Geraldine Valentine have taken over 175 photos of people who strongly identify with Bridgeport. And this project's been going since 2014 and it's ongoing. Each portrait has a beautiful, personal, moving story that accompanies it. And through this exhibition, visitors have an opportunity to think about democracy in action and expand upon the official narratives, including the lived experience of people from the city. This, just to clarify, this part of the two-part exhibition will only be in Bridgeport. It's not traveling to Gateway or Norwalk. So make sure to check it out before February 24th. Next slide, please. So returning back to the Practice of Democracy show, we wanted to find different ways to activate the exhibition. So working with my colleague, Alex Valientes, we developed a strong program of in-person and virtual events to reach a wide audience. So on the left, you see a packed house of over 80 Housatonic Community College students and community members for a lecture that Professor Sarah Churchill gave called Slums in the Sky, How Photography Killed Mass Social Housing. And yesterday we had a workshop on the intersections of food sovereignty and social justice. As I mentioned, we had students give tours of the exhibition, and it was really delightful to see faculty members engaged with the show. So in response to these red prompts that were in circles throughout the gallery, faculty members actually had students go around and write responses to them in the form of long form essays as part of their assignments. And they would use the material in the gallery as sources for their research and for their responses. And as you'll also see on the right, engagement and an interaction were intentionally built into the exhibition itself. So visitors had the opportunity to share their stories and make their mark through contributing to the guest book, recording stories using a phone in the gallery, write on stickers such as this one and post them as a response, and also provide feedback through a survey in the gallery. So this question, if you can't read it, says, was your neighborhood affected by these historical forces? And the anonymous person wrote back, yes, and has caused my neighborhood to be undesirable because of flooding issues due to town neglect. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most popular form of engagement has actually been the map that Melissa gestured towards earlier, the redlining map, where visitors use push pins to show where they previously lived, which is the yellow push pin, or where they currently live, which is the white push pin. And we've had, it just keeps growing and growing every day. And finally, I'll mention that we received quite a lot of press thanks to this exhibition. So we had a Channel 12 news story by Lori Goliath that will give you a sense of the opening and the exhibitions, and I just posted that in the chat. So make sure to take a look after sometime later today. Next slide, please. And finally, I have a few shameless plugs because as the director, this is part of my role. So I want to just invite you all to the Black History Month celebration of the arts that we're hosting at Housatonic Community College next Wednesday, February 22nd from 3:30 to 6:30. We'll have art tours, music, poetry, dance, spoken word. It's going to be quite the evening. And I will also put the links that you see in the chat so that you can stay in touch and also support our educational and exhibition programs. Next slide, please. And finally, as was mentioned, this is the first of two additional stops. So on March 6th through April 14th, the show will travel to the NewAlliance Foundation Art Gallery at Gateway Community College. And then April 24th to June 2nd, it will head to the Art Gallery at the East Campus at Norwalk Community College. And part of this is quite important because, as some of you may know, all of our community colleges will be merging under one called CT State. So this type of collaboration is part of the way that we enjoy working together as sister institutions. I think that's all I have in the deck. So I'll hand it back over to Elihu and Melissa.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for those plugs. I want to reiterate that I really hope everyone will have a chance to visit the Housatonic Museum of Art or one of these other locations. But I have to say the setting at the Housatonic Community College with the art all over the walls everywhere, infusing the whole space, it's amazing. And Jennifer told me that the Housatonic Community College used to be a shopping mall, which once she mentioned it, of course, I couldn't get out of my head. So it's a fascinating place to visit. Go to the Housatonic Museum of Art. The Bridgeport portrait project is really beautiful, really inspiring, and a great compliment. And the whole experience is great. And you can see in both of our backgrounds that we have a shot from the exhibit there as well. I was really impressed with the exhibit. It's the Practice of Democracy exhibit. Its breadth, its synthesis of really big and complicated historical trends in a way that was accessible and engaging, and the richness of its place-based storytelling, in this case from Bridgeport, New Haven, and Norwalk. And then finally, or not finally, but also its call to action to enrich our practices of democracy. And I think there are a lot of avenues for us to discuss as a group here, but I want to remind our audience to please submit your questions and comments in the Q&A feature, which I'll be monitoring here. So please feel free to do that so that we can, unfortunately, the webinar format does not allow us to have, I don't think, or maybe it can, for you to voice your own question, but if you can't, then I'll do my best to voice it for you. So please engage in that way. So with all that in mind, maybe here's one place to start, and I'll throw this out there. Melissa, maybe you want to jump in first with a reaction, and then we can discuss. I think that when many of us think of democracy, at least initially, the first thing that may come to mind is, voting, direct participation in electing government officials, and then maybe by extension, other forms of civic activism. But what comes through this exhibit is that a study of democracy is a lot more, and involves these place-based spatial histories. And there is a theme in the exhibit that the practice of democracy is inherently a spatial practice, which I guess includes locations where democratic actions take place, but then also something more about how the built environment produces and reproduces patterns of equity, accessibility, opportunity. Melissa, are those patterns which come out in this exhibit, are they really a key part of thinking about democratic practice?
I think they absolutely, of course, my answer is going to be, of course they are, right? And it's how democracy actually shows up in our individual lives every day, right? It's those decisions that are made through, the democratic, as it were, process, but sort of whose voices are being heard in that process. And then what does it look like? How does it come out on the other end in terms of the communities that we have, the way that they're built, the way that we invest or disinvest, and how we live with that, and then who we are, in society, and who has access to opportunity and to spaces that are great spaces to be in, and who is resigned or has no real other opportunity but to be in places that are not welcoming and are not caring and nurturing. And so that really is, I think it's so interesting because we don't necessarily, like you said, think about that as democracy, but it is probably the thing we are all most directly attached to every single day. It's sort of just urban planning in general, right? When you start to talk to people about what could be sort of wonky urban planning type issues, everyone has an opinion and a perspective because we're all living in these environments that we've created, through this process.
Yeah, that's so. Jennifer, do you want to speak to that as well?
Yeah, I was just going to add that that I think one thing we forgot to mention is the intentional siting of this exhibition in community colleges, which when Melissa's talking about access to opportunity, you know, our community college systems are that, right? Like that is oftentimes the pathway. It's open to lifelong learners. Like everyone is welcome in community colleges and they're very approachable. So I think that the siting of the exhibition at 3 of our community college was intentional. You know, we think about expanding our hours. We've expanded from 8:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Friday to accommodate for working families. And, you know, we're always thinking about how can both the community college and the museum be that access to opportunity. So I just wanted to kind of add that in and piggyback off what Melissa was saying.
I'm so glad you did, Jennifer, because it was so intentional, just like we're talking about these intentional decisions. Absolutely was to bring it to spaces that are open and accessible and part of community, and to share all of this in that way was very much a part of the intention and the design, not only of the panels, but of the practice of democracy and the intention of the exhibit and what we're hoping it will achieve sort of more broadly.
Yeah, that's great. And it is so special that it's being hosted in the community colleges and that it builds solidarity between Connecticut cities. I feel like that doesn't happen often enough. We're often in our own silo. I study New Haven. I think about Bridgeport. Can we discuss that a little bit? Why is it important that this exhibit is comparative and looking across these cities and places? What do we gain from that kind of perspective here?
I think sort of what you just said, really, right? It's, you know, we might be in our own cities and think that these issues are sort of particular or unique to, you know, one place or another in the state, in the region, across the whole country. But when we start to really unpack it, we realize that there's so much similarity because of the policies and the intentional decisions that were made that created the environments that we have in our urban centers versus our suburban areas. And that it couldn't be more stark than in Connecticut, where we have, you know, very wealthy, primarily white suburbs. And then we have cities that are primarily people of color, which have seen a lot of disinvestment. And that's not an accident. That's really, you know, part of showing these different histories and kind of comparing them is to show how similar they are. Those redlining maps, you know, really just lay it out. You can see it, that the intentional decisions that were made by the Homeowners Loan Corporation have created the spatial practice that we have. And so that's not unique to New Haven or Bridgeport or Norwalk, but it's important to ground it in those cities so you can really understand sort of how it's played out over time based on those policies and that history.
Yeah, and I'll just say that from us, it's been really nice getting to know colleagues at Gateway that I wouldn't have worked as closely with, because, you know, of the distance and being in different institutions. And again, that will change when we're all CT State even more. But sharing things like programming ideas, I mean, the fact that this is even a 2-part sort of conversation, one virtual, one in person at Gateway, trying to build bridges there. I think also you know, sharing lesson plans and ideas of faculty members and assignments from Housatonic to Gateway. You know, a lot of the faculty do teach adjunct in multiple community colleges, but it's nice to be able to share this exhibition and the generative sort of lesson plans and other sort of teaching that happens. And then I'll also say that I really do, like, as someone who's based in New Haven, who now works in Bridgeport, it has just opened my eyes completely in a way that I think New Haven has like a gravitational pull, and that gravitational pull can often be Yale, but it's really sort of liberating to kind of be in different spaces, to go to different campuses. And there are art-wide art initiatives like this Connecticut Art Trail, Connecticut collections that are looking at the state as a whole and trying to think really creatively about how to get people engaged in arts institutions, which may also kind of pull into this idea of democracy in America.
Yeah, absolutely. Melissa, I wanted to pick up on something you said about the fact that these intentional policies, you know, applied to all of these places. And I think that's such an important point. I mean, it reminds me, first of all, in terms of intentionality of the title of that very important recent book by Richard Rothstein, Segregation by Design. And I think it can come as a shock to some who haven't looked at the materials from the interwar period from the 1930s, the degree to which these forms of prejudice and discrimination were written into our laws, written into our assessors' manuals in a way that made the results a foregone conclusion, a self-fulfilling prophecy in some sense. And it's a disturbing fact about our cities that we have to confront. And certainly the redlining maps are one indication of that. And one of the things these cities really do share is that urban redevelopment legacy. I mean, what we find is that the areas that are starved of capital during the redlining period are, again, in a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, also then targeted as the areas most susceptible to the kind of wholesale clearance that was such a trauma for hundreds of American cities at mid-century, and including many of our cities in Connecticut. There was a terrific project up at Connecticut College not long ago about urban renewal in New London, and all of these cities share this kind of history. And I'm just wondering, Melissa, if you can help us think about that a little bit from the perspective of democracy. In other words, how in a democratic society did we allow that to happen? Or how was public consensus for this dramatic urban upheaval? How was it produced in a democratic society? How did we get to the point that it was not only acceptable, but desirable to carry out this kind of deeply unfair restructuring of the city, all the while being advanced by, in some cases, ostensibly progressive, democratic mayors, Great Society era politicians. Can we discuss that a little bit? I think it's one of the tricky, difficult pieces of this history.
It's difficult because it's so obvious, right? It's whose voices are heard and whose aren't. And it's, to put it very plainly, racism. It's well-intentioned, perhaps, or not, white people primarily that were in positions of power and may have had a view, and I don't obviously know what was going on in people's brains, but that there was some sort of, altruism or public health or whatever kind of ideas were acceptable at the time as part of, what the society was driving for, that were kind of underpinning these decisions. But who was being asked their opinion, who was being represented at those drawing boards when highways were being just run straight through people's neighborhoods and businesses and lives? That wasn't representative. It was just representative of the people whose voices people thought mattered. And that certainly wasn't people of color living in these communities. And so, I think that's the very ugly truth of, the answer to the question from my perspective. It's actually not that complicated. It's, very racist public policies that have been enshrined in our institutions and, policies and programs like urban renewal.
Was that a failure of democracy, or a moment in the history of democracy as kind of yet unfulfilled promise of democracy, or is it the result that can sometimes occur in a democracy? How do we reconcile with that?
I think we have to be honest about power, right? It's a really big piece of the dynamic, and there's democracy, and the way it's practiced, but again, by who and for whom, and who is at the table, who is, looking for whose opinion. It's an idea unfulfilled if we're being very honest about, really being democratic. How much does a person's voice matter? How many, what percentage of a person gets to vote? All of that history of our of our country. It's enshrined in, you know, from the very beginning of how we practice democracy in America and how we always have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That was a particularly dramatic moment where, you know, in a sense, decades of thinking about urban reform and reacting to the perceived ills of the industrial city, its density, its congestion, some very well-meaning progressive thinking around housing, that people shouldn't have to live in tenements without running water, that these conditions weren't desirable, and that something should be done. I think undeniably condescending and paternalistic, but as you say, in a heartbreaking way, also well-meaning. And it always seemed to me that this emphasis on comprehensive, wholesale, planned clearance, you know, really came at the expense of more thoughtful rehabilitation of places and neighborhoods that would have left more of them intact. And I wonder if you think that that was, in a way, a kind of failure of the imagination of the planners, or the legacy of decades of this desire, again, on the part of some, on the part of those in power, on the part of those in political power, or even the professional planning practice. You know, they were desperate in some sense to clear out these parts of the city.
Yeah, I mean, it's the harder work, right? I mean, to go, you know,
Right.
block by block and talk to people about what people actually want to see and what improvements, you know, would really be meaningful and strengthen communities. It's so much easier to, you know, be kind of removed from that and be at your drawing board and just bulldoze the whole thing and decide to start over. And it really is very arrogant, I would say, that you would have the sense that you were doing good works by eliminating people's homes and their communities and creating something better for other people without having ever discussed it with them. Or I mean, imagine, you know, anybody on this Zoom, somebody just deciding for you. How democratic is that? That they know better what life you want to have, and they're going to make it for you, and somehow that you'll be very happy with the outcome. You know, it is just arrogant is just the word I would use for that.
It is, and it was backed up by the power of the state, and literally the police power of the state to be able to enforce this kind of dispossession that lies behind these processes. And I think scholars today are doing a better job at trying to uncover the voices of resistance from that time. In New Haven, we had the American Independent Movement publish a newsletter that came out strongly against some of these policies. By the mid to late 60s, you're starting to see communities rise up in resistance to the urban highways, for example, and we start to have the highway revolts of the late 1960s. And then, of course, a whole much broader social movements of the late 1960s in which communities of color across the United States take to the streets in acts of civil disobedience to express their sense of unfairness, at least in part due to the uneven results from urban renewal. So we do see that kind of democratic resurgence in the 1960s. Is that something that is reflected in the kind of trajectory of the exhibit? When do we start seeing more voices being aired in the public realm and having more impact?
I think on the timeline, I'd almost say it's hard to say, because we continually have these movements. We continue to have them today. You know, we've had tremendous protests and reckoning around the murder of George Floyd in 2020 in the spring. If I remember correctly, we had community out on 95, you know, stopping the traffic in protest. And that, you know, continues, and it has, but has it repaired the damage that we've done, you know, to our cities? You know, where are we in that conversation? We still, I would argue, are kind of close to the beginning in terms of really making the changes that we need to make. A really important tie-in for the Center for Housing Opportunity and Regional Plan Association with putting this exhibit on in the first place is really to highlight the history in order to make it very clear why we're asking for the changes that we're asking for with respect to land use and zoning reform. And there's a huge conversation in the state of Connecticut about this, and huge resistance continues and pushback around the notion that there's something inequitable and unjust about our zoning and our land use in this state. And there's still a really strong misunderstanding, whether it's willful or intentional, to how we got here. So I don't know that we've really made that much progress as much as we continue to protest. I think we've seen some good change, and we've definitely seen a lot of movement. I'd say over the last 3 to 5 years, at least in the conversation and the narrative, which is a huge important step forward. And we've had some reforms statewide, but it's still a really long way to go. We continue to hear this idea that, well, if people just worked harder, I worked hard, someday you could live in this, very special community with single family homes too, without recognizing all the things that have gotten us to the place where that is simply unattainable for so many people because of the inability to accumulate intergenerational wealth. And it all goes back to the ability to buy those homes in the suburban communities in this time period, and the disinvestment that happened in the cities at the same time that those suburbs are really proliferating for only a certain part of the community, the white part of the community. So that's a long answer to the question, which is, I think we have a long way to go, and that democracy is slow progress in this area in particular, I would say.
It's a really helpful answer, and it leads me to the next kind of topic I wanted to discuss a little bit. I think that the exhibit makes a really persuasive case that the history of democracy, the practices of democracy, are spatial practices that are related often to housing, and the politics of urban development and the politics of urban change. That's one of the key kind of arguments of the exhibit. And I was hoping that you would say more about what you just referred to. And maybe this is an opportunity to tell our audience a little bit more about the RPA and its history, and how it is attempting now to advocate for particular land use policies, part of a very long 100-year-old tradition of advancing ideas about how cities should grow and change. And I imagine there's some interesting history of just how the politics of the RPA itself has changed over the years and its kind of values. But I think some of our audience I'd be very interested to hear more about that.
Sure. No, that's a great question. And I'd love to share it. I almost don't even know where to begin because there's so much there. I guess I'll just start with a little framing, for folks who don't know the RPA. We just celebrated our centennial this past May, and we actually had a huge exhibition, another exhibition in Grand Central on our 100-year history, and sort of.
Yes, that was great. That was terrific.
A lot of fun. And really, in part, as we're celebrating our centennial, or I should say in very large part, we are reflecting back and looking at our role as a civic and business leader kind of originated organization in the tri-state region, and our hand in the decisions that were made, and really our responsibility at this point in our history to really take a lead role and address them. And that's not new for RPA. I actually was been looking, for some materials, and I'll share some things in the chat for tonight. Even as early as the 60s, as you mentioned, and the 70s, we were doing a lot of thinking and reflecting, and democracy. It was really fun exhibition. Well, I imagine it was fun. It was before my time, but we did a series called Choices for 76 in the early 70s, where it was this massive, very interesting democratic sort of project where we went out to the entire tri-state region. We did these films that one of them won, I think, an Academy Award, and we did surveys, and we reached thousands and thousands of people, and we're asking them questions about the day around transportation and housing and environment and all the issues that are still the issues of the day today. So we have been looking at these issues for a very, very long time. And I think we're at a really exciting moment in our history as an organization and as a country around this topic, where land use reform and zoning are actually things that maybe not everybody talks about every day, but a lot more people do than ever did before. I can just share, my mother sends me pictures, actually cuts out articles from the Providence Journal, my parents in Rhode Island, and sends them to me because this is front page news, you know, in Rhode Island and across, you know, all over the place, because we're all talking about it. And I think, you know, as far as the Regional Plan Association is concerned, we are very, I don't want to use the word excited, that's probably not, but we are excited to be in a moment where we can really be working very specifically and directly on undoing and changing public policy around land use and zoning. And in Connecticut, you know, we're very big advocates and partners with the Desegregated Connecticut Coalition, with the Center for Housing Opportunity, as I've mentioned several times, to really be on the ground and, you know, in Hartford and talking to communities and really advancing a conversation and making change in terms of democracy on the legislative side, and what the laws are, what the rules are that govern these decisions. And so that is very much a central piece of our work today. And just some bigger picture framing, the way we do our work is we put out long range plans for the region about once every generation. Our first plan was in 1929, and our most recent plan was 2017. And the 2017 plan really squarely focused in on this issue of making the region affordable for everyone. That's sort of the grand vision. And how we do that, you know, what are the actual practices and policies and projects and programs that advance that? This piece of work around the practice of democracy is really, really critical to moving that and actually making real impactful change.
Yeah, I will have a follow-up to that, but before I ask it, I just want to remind our attendees that if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, if you are thinking in your own mind of some of your own spatial practices of democracy in your everyday life, then it would be very interesting to hear about that. Or if there is a housing land use issue that you see connected to this trajectory that you'd like to raise, please go ahead and put it in the chat. And Melissa, I think this is so exciting, and I think it's really astounding that the RPA has been around for 100 years and continues to advocate for good planning, even as our ideas of good planning might have changed over the years. So is there an example of a policy that you're excited about or inspired by that you think that Connecticut City should take up? Or let me say, not Connecticut cities, Connecticut regions, because so often the issue with affordability is getting the suburbs involved, for example. So is there an example or more than one example that you'd like to share about one of those policies that the RPA is supporting?
I would love to. We are working, as I mentioned, with the Desegregated Connecticut Coalition, who many folks know. And so we're working very specifically to advance legislation, Work, Live, Ride, which is for transit-oriented development. You know, it's a very smart way to look at land use and zoning, and specifically where we're investing in infrastructure. And if we look at what we're zoning for near transit and where we're putting state money and infrastructure investment, it would make sense that our land use and our zoning would accurately reflect that investment. So where we have, you know, an opportunity to create more homes, and we need, part of it is a supply issue, and then obviously there's the affordability issue, and those things go together really directly and specifically. Part of the reason why everything is so costly and unaffordable is because we don't have enough. And then add on top of that, we don't have nearly enough at levels that people can really afford who don't have, you know, incomes that are X% above the average, right? So we have, for example, a number that we talk about all the time, which is that there are 86,000 people in Connecticut in the 0 to 30% income range who we need homes for. So how are we even going to begin to touch those kind of numbers if we don't look at our zoning, and if we don't change our zoning? And really, to the points we've been making throughout this whole conversation, the way we zoned at the time where we were also doing urban renewal, and as a legacy of redlining, was to be specifically exclusionary and create very large lot zoning all over the place, and really not provide opportunities to create more density outside of the cities. And so that's really something we can do that's really specific, is rezone land near transit to allow for more homes, which, you know, it's only one thing. It doesn't solve for everything, but it seems like the least we can do, honestly. Are
you thinking particularly about like Metro North stations? Is that one of the key examples, or are there other things that are coming to mind?
there's Metro North, there's CT Fast Track. I would say certain areas where, you know, the bus service is more frequent and there are kind of more, so downtown centers, you know, town center kind of areas. Those are all really interesting opportunities. And then if you add on top of that, where there's publicly owned land and municipalities can, because part of creating more affordability is obviously writing down the cost of development. So, you know, these things can all work really well together. If we do those things, if we identify the sites, if we zone properly, if we have the subsidies that we need to make the affordability possible, there are solutions. It's not sort of completely intractable. We just have to be willing.
Absolutely. And it, just as you say, as you began with, that it's intentional, it's by design. The origins of zoning were intended to keep multifamily housing out of single family districts. The Euclid v. Ambler is all about preventing apartments from being built in a suburb. And so to use those very tools to undo those patterns and facilitate new patterns, it absolutely has to be done. I'm interested in the transportation piece too. I often think that in Connecticut, we need to be doubling down on our buses. I'm curious, is that pop up in some of these I mean, our rail is an incredible asset, obviously, but New Haven is a bus city. Bridgeport is a bus city. I think Norwalk probably is too, although I'm less familiar with it. Maybe someone can chime in. And we need to be really doubling down on the buses and making them absolutely appealing to everyone and useful to everyone. I wonder if there's a role for that in thinking about kind of access, equity, democracy in the city.
100. I'm so glad you raised that, Elihu, because we don't talk about it enough, right? The fact of who rides the bus, how much money we invest in the bus, who rides the commuter rail, and how much money we invest there. When we look at the pandemic, ridership on Metro North dropped by, I want to say 90-95%. There was no one on Metro North. The bus service only ever dropped by 50%. It never went lower than that because all the essential workers, primarily people of color, riding buses, where that infrastructure, you don't have bus shelters, people are standing in the rain, they're standing on the side of the road. The buses aren't necessarily clean or attractive. And that is absolutely, again, an intentional decision when we decide where we're going to allocate funding for transportation. And we decide not to invest in our bus system, which is we so rely on in our cities. As you said, again, that's a democratic decision that we're making, and for whom and by who.
I think that this is one way to kind of bring us full circle here as we come to the end of the hour, because we know that we live in a society where there's enough. There is enough. It's the inequality that is so grotesque. And so everything is a political decision in that sense. We could decide that everyone should have excellent bus service, that everyone should have excellent education. It is a political decision in a society where income inequality is so revolting, for lack of a better term. Sorry, that's just what came to mind. So we should have another session about transportation like that, because you know, I love riding bikes. I'm a bike rider. There's nothing wrong with building bike lanes, but in some ways, it gets me somehow that we're sometimes seeming like putting roads on a diet, but not really doubling down on the buses and the bike lanes themselves. I have these questions about their real equity in terms of investments too. I know that's probably not popular amongst our bike loving audience members, and I am too, but let me get to a comment here, please, before we close here, because Charlene has what she says is what they say are less of a question and more of a statement about personal learning as related to this exhibit. And my understanding, their understanding of neighborhood level democracy or lack thereof. The July 2021 issue of National Geographic magazine is about heat zones, lack of trees and green space in urban and lower income neighborhoods. It was striking to them at the time that they read it, Charlene, of the systemic racism that threads through zoning development and relates also to health, quality of life, and global warming. That's very helpful, Charlene, in bringing those things together. Do you agree with that?
100%. It's all related. It's pervasive. It's very much, it's the spatial practice of democracy, right? It's exactly what we've been talking about all night. It's all the investments or disinvestments. And it's pretty obvious once you take a look. And that really is the intention. One of the intentions behind the exhibit is to just shine a light and make that really clear and get this conversation going. And, you know, not to speak for the designer of the exhibition, but, you know, in talking to April about this, you know, she's very clear, this is not meant to be just an exhibition and then we all see it and then we walk away from it. We really need to think about what do we do next with this information? Where do we take it? And so continuing these conversations and then, you know, the actions around those conversations.
Absolutely. And I hope that we will be inspired, and we are inspired by this exhibit to take action. I cannot recommend people enough to go to the Housatonic Museum. The exhibit is up there until the end of next week, I think. And then it will take a short break to travel to Gateway Community College in New Haven, Connecticut. So that's very, very exciting. And then on to Norwalk Community College. Boy, this has really been fun. I wonder if there's any last words. Jennifer, would you like to add anything as we make our way out?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add that these issues of housing insecurity, food insecurity, transportation directly impact our students as well at Housatonic Community College. So to have a space to even be able to see some of that history and that it is a systemic issue, and to sort of have some of those conversations, I think is another really important aspect of it being cited in very specific locations. So I do hope that you all have a chance to see and visit and to support your local community colleges.
Thank you. And Melissa, thank you so much for being with us and for being a part of this project and for describing it so beautifully. And any last words that you'd like to say to our audience?
Just thank you. You know, obviously, you know, we do the work every day and, you know, you're kind of just in it. And I'll be honest, it's been a very long day today. And I was thinking, oh gosh, do I have it in me to have this conversation? But it's so nice to have a space to really talk about why we do this and these issues and really grapple with what it means, you know, when we talk about democracy. And so it's been great for me too, just to have a little time and space to actually enjoy the exhibit a little bit more just by having the conversation with all of you. So thank you.
Excellent. So interesting. So great. Thank you again to the New Haven Free Public Library, to Marion Huggins for being with us tonight. And thank you very much to Democracy in America and Public Humanities, represented by our ACE webinar producer extraordinaire, Jake Gagne. Thank you very much, Jake, for making this happen. And thanks to all of you out there in Zoom world for spending a little bit of time with us and exploring this truly outstanding and inspiring exhibit. So with that, we are going to sign off for the evening. Please go to all these links and websites and come to the next webinars and meetings, and we'll see you out there in the Zoom world and in the live public realm, hopefully as well. So good night, everyone. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.